Esther chapter 6. If you'll remember, give you a quick update of where we were. You remember in the ending or beginning of Esther chapter 6, the king was in one of those sleepless nights. You know how those are. You can't sleep, so you get up to go do something else. So he got up and someone was reading to him the books in which contain the history of his kingdom. It's interesting to me that he did that, isn't that to you? What would we get up and do if we couldn't sleep? Because there's nothing else on, so we'll exercise the thumb, and maybe if we're lucky, we'll trade to the other hand and we'll work the other thumb. That's what we do. But isn't it interesting? The king here, he's reading from the book that details his kingdom's history. Why do you think he did that? Why do you think he did that? Maybe out of boredom. He's proud to be the king, very possible. I think there's another explanation, maybe. Maybe he thought they would bore him. Okay, there's two other explanations. I think he could learn something from past history too. We understand that if we forget our history as a people, what are we going to do? We're going to repeat it. And what do you think we're doing in this country? We're forgetting our history. Eventually, we will be doomed to repeat it. So he's spending time in this particular section, and he commanded someone to come bring the book of records of the Chronicles, verse 1, and they were read before the king. And do you remember what happened in verse 2? Who was mentioned in verse 2? Mordecai. Mordecai shows up in the book's records of the king. And Mordecai had ended a plot to take the king's life. And thus we stand here in the ending of verse 5 and beginning of verse 6 where the king sees Haman in the court, and this is where we ended last week, and he calls for Haman to be brought in. And look at verse 6. So Haman came in, and the king said unto him, What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now Haman thought in his heart, To whom would the king delight to honor more than to myself? Two parts of this verse. Number one, the king asked a question. What would you do if you had someone you needed to honor, a great honor? How would you bestow that upon them? Then part two, here's Haman. What did Haman do? What did Haman have? I call it big head syndrome. He walked into the room, the king asked just a general question, and what does Haman's head do? So what is the only thing Haman can think of? Well, Haman, oh, you want to honor me. I've always wondered when you read verse 6, what was his facial expression? Because the face doesn't lie, does it? Oh. Couldn't you see him straightening if he was wearing a tie, which we know he wasn't, but you could see him straightening up his garments and just cinching everything up. This is what I would do. Verse 7, Then Haman answered the king, For the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head, and let his apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with all whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaim before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. It's a pretty good honor, isn't it? Now, we would, of course, put this in modern terms. If Haman was answering the president, what would this be? Well, you get your presidential limo, and you send him on a tour all across the United States, and you just send him everywhere, and you let it be known publicly in the streets, on the television, everywhere you can, that you are honoring this man. It's a pretty big honor, isn't it? To let the entire kingdom of peoples know, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to give it to you. But what's happening in verses 7 through 9? What is this response? Is this what Haman would do to someone he wanted to honor? Or is this what Haman would have done if he were being honored? It was him. He was confident. I mean, it's interesting to me that we are in many occasions like Haman. when we fall into tragedies such as this in verse 6. Now Haman thought in his heart. How many times in the New Testament is Jesus responding to people or in the presence of others and Jesus knew the thoughts and the intents of his heart? How many times for us are our words a little bit different than the thoughts of our heart? If we're willing to be honest, probably more than we'd like to admit. But here's Haman. He didn't change it one bit. Here's what I would do to the man that you want to honor. And he gave the king his recommendation so he would get it himself. Now he gives him the royal clothes. He gives him the crown. He gets the royal horse. But not only that, Haman says, let one of the most noble princes deliver this man. All of these things, and he proclaim it through the streets. That this is how the king gives his approval. That's right. That's right. Let's jump ahead because we get to read and we know what happens. What's going to be Haman's downfall? What has Haman already built? Oh, he's built a gallows. For who? Yeah, it's extremely high for Mordecai, so everyone could see it. Isn't it interesting that Haman's form of punishment is the same as Haman's form of reward? Everyone's going to see the punishment. He built the gallows extremely high so it could be seen throughout the land. And then this horse and this royal crown, this royal robe, this prominent man to bring him through the city, the punishment and the reward equally in the same ideascape of Haman. That's right. If he would have just been a little bit patient. But pride has a problem with patience, doesn't it? Pride and patience conflict, pride and truth conflict, and evidently pride and the king are going to conflict here soon. But as you enter into verse 10, I want you to notice something here. Then the king said to Haman, make haste and take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said. Now pause for a minute. Pause. What has the king done every time someone has recommended something to him? Remember in the opening of the book, King, your wife, your queen, she's disrespected you, and she's going to teach all of our wives to disrespect us. You need to put her away. Puts her away. Yeah, that's right. He's listening, and he hears something that sounds good. Now, he doesn't consider any ramifications of this. So what does he do here? Oh, Haman, let's do this. Now, for Haman, he's not going to like this. As thou hast said, verse 10, and even do so to Mordecai, the Jew, that sitteth at the king's gate, let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. There are several things that are being recognized right here. Number one, Haman is being recognized. What did Haman say? Who did Haman say should go through the kingdom proclaiming this great honor? Well, king, you get your most trusted man, your greatest prince, and he'll do this honor. Is Haman being honored? He is. He's the king's number one man. Isn't that how the royal decree was put out here? You get your best man in all of your people, and he can take this man through the street. Who is that? That's Haman. Isn't that interesting? Haman's being honored, but Haman does not like the honor that he's being given. We often miss that. We see the slight that Haman feels, and we feel the slight that Haman feels, because most likely we've endured something of such nature. We thought we should deserve an honor, and we didn't get the one we thought we were going to get. Yeah. It is very, very common of today's politics. You're right. That's right. The recognition he wanted was as he described. He wanted that horse. He wanted that royal robe. He wanted that royal crown. He wanted that proclamation. But instead, he was giving and taking that royal. He was taking the crown. He was taking the king's garment. He was taking the proclamation, to the people. So, number one, we recognize that the king is recognizing Haman. You're my number one man. I think we miss that when we read through it quite often. But number two, what else is the king recognizing? What is Mordecai, or what has Haman had the king sign into law? All the Jews are going to die. What's the king recognize about Mordecai? Oh, did you notice that? Do even so to Mordecai, the Jew. It does make me question that. Yeah, it does make me question that, because here, how does he recognize Mordecai? Mordecai the Jew. Why would you honor someone of which your royal decree is going to murder? It makes me wonder, how much did he know that was going on in his kingdom? I know his signet ring signed that document, but how much did he really know about what was going on in his kingdom? So he honors Mordecai. And number three, there's something else that happens in this particular scene. He honors Haman's request. Did you notice this at the end of verse 10? Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. Don't miss a detail, Haman. You take him the royal garment. You take him the crown. Most likely, where was that crown? Where was that crown? Would have been in one of two places. For one, it would have been under royal guard, or it would have been where? As the proclamation was spoken. One of the two places it would have been. You get the royal horse. Don't miss this detail. And don't miss the proclamation. He firms up his word. And then there's verse 11. Then took Haman the apparel and the horse, and arrayed Mordecai, and brought him on horseback through the streets of the city, and proclaimed before him, Thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. What a turn of events for Haman and for Mordecai. But we're learning something of Haman. He recognizes something, doesn't he? Does Haman recognize something in verse 11? What does Haman recognize in verse 11? In the context of verse 11. Who does Haman have to obey? The king. Despite the humiliation Haman felt, he knew better than to disobey royal orders. The same should be true for you and me. Galatians chapter 6, 7, and 8. What royal orders do we serve? We have them with us all the time, don't we? And just like Haman, we have a choice to make. Haman's choice would have been physical death. That's what would have happened to him if he despised and rejected the king's orders. And interestingly enough, spiritual death will be our demise if we despise and reject the king's orders. Delivering the clothing horse to Mordecai would have been an ordeal to Haman, but having to lead the horse through the city and proclaim as he went would have been offered the ultimate indignity, and to him the ultimate disrespect, because he should have been proclaimed instead of Mordecai. We've learned that. Oftentimes in this book, his anger has gotten red hot toward Mordecai. Now notice verse 12. This will show us the character of Haman and the character of Mordecai. Just read to the first period. And Mordecai came again to the king's gate. Why was Mordecai going to the king's gate? That's where business takes place, but I think there's a second reason. Maybe, I don't know that that's quite it. Where often did Mordecai go to find out about Esther? To the king's gate, the king's court. Now look at the rest of the passage. But Haman, oh Haman, hasted to his house mourning and having his head covered. Boy, isn't that a difference? What do you think Haman was doing with his head covered? Shame. Maybe he was covering his anger. Maybe he was covering his weeping. The idea of mourning here, he hasted to his house in mourning, gives us the idea of the context of a great loss, as if it were the loss of a loved one. What happens in the loss of a loved one? There's great mourning and there are great tears. I often wonder if that's what Haman was doing with his head covered. Mordecai stationed himself at the king's gate, which was his custom. And Haman ran home to the people in which had given him the idea to build a gallows for Mordecai. Now look at verse 13. Haman's going to talk to his wife and his friends, and in the beginning of that, he told his friends everything and his wife that had befallen him. Then said his wise men, and his wife unto him, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shall surely fail before him. Mordecai goes home and tells all his friends and his wife, the great failures, and he held nothing back from them. He told them everything. If he'd arrived the day before, remember he had a different report. I'm being invited to the queen's dinner, and only the king's going to be there. And I got invited back to the queen's dinner, and only the king's going to be there. And now all of a sudden it's different, isn't it? Great rejoicing has been turned into great mourning. And the wise men he consulted apparently on call whenever he needed them, joined in with his wife in predicting the ultimate victory of Mordecai. Why was Mordecai going to be the victor in all of this? It was God's, of course, but why did they think Mordecai was going to stand victor against Haman? Might take Haman's place. But who's on Mordecai's side? Yes, God, but who else? Esther and the king. Who sent Haman into the streets to proclaim the greatness of Mordecai? The king. Who went to Haman to request, how will I honor someone? The king. Who sent Haman into the streets? The king. Who's on Mordecai's side? It's the king. And thus Haman, his counsel, and his wife understand that he is running down a road he cannot win. How many times do we need to be the wise counsel of someone and tell them you're running down a road you cannot win? How many times do we need to be the wise spouse of someone and tell our husband or wife that you're running down a road you cannot win? I think there's a lot of example in verse 13. Here's everything that's happened to me. It's time to stop this foolishness. It's time to stop this. Verse 14, while they were talking, it's interesting to me, all of this is happening in this scene. He runs back to his home crying. They tell them, you need to stop this foolishness. And verse 14 teaches us this. And while they were yet talking with him, came in the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Oh boy, isn't this different? How happy was he to go to the banquet that Esther had prepared just the day before? Oh, he came home and told everybody, look at me, look at me. He was the man. Interestingly enough, wasn't he the man in the proclamation that the king was honoring? You're my number one, Haman. He missed that, didn't he? And how often do we miss those things inside of life when those things happen? But in the future. That's right. That's right. We're not guaranteed anything. We're not guaranteed the next hour, the next second, the next minute. How far had Haman planned? I'd probably say a lifetime, wouldn't you? And while they were still discussing this matter, while he was still trying to make his plans to navigate what had happened to him in this day, the chamberlains came and they took him to the banquet. That tells me something about Esther. She liked to be on time because she sent some chamberlains to go get Haman, and it's time to go to the banquet. You're coming or you're not. And they took him to the banquet. Yes, he does. Yes, he does. That's right. Let's just ask this question, and I may regret this in just a moment, but I'm going to ask it, so y'all be good. What's the point of a politician? It's a good question, isn't it? What's the point of a politician? What's the point of a prince? The idea of a prince here, he's a politician. He serves the king and he serves the people. But what's the point of a politician? The voice of the people. Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. Now, we understand that government is God's minister for good, and we're not supposed to fear the government because government should be, as God designed it, punishing the evildoer. Punishing the evildoer. Book of Romans. I think it's chapter 13, if I'm correct. But what's the point of a politician? What's the point of a prince? To understand the feelings of a nation. To understand the feelings of a nation. That was the point of the prince. But also to proclaim things to the nation. What was Haman doing leading that horse around town? He was proclaiming something to the nation, wasn't he? In this particular scene. So it's chapter 7. The dinner is prepared. The guests have arrived or are arriving in our minds. Remember, Haman has just been wished out of his house. Remember, he went into his home with his head covered. Now what's he got to do? He's got to get himself together as he goes back to the queen's banquet. Now look at verse 1 as it enters in. So the king and Haman came to the banquet with Esther the queen. Can't you imagine this for just a minute? Here's Haman and here's the king, and they're walking into this banquet together. What's Haman thinking? King's right beside him. What's Haman thinking? Maybe. I think that's very possible. I think there's a second explanation. That's probably what he's thinking. How you made me go deliver this man through the city that was supposed to be for me? Can't get much worse. And verse 2, and the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted to thee. And what is thy request? It shall be performed even to half of the kingdom. The king's curiosity, he can't even get to the meal. What do you want? Well, men lack patience. Men lack patience. So now on the second day, what do you want? What's your request? I'll do anything up to half the kingdom. You've just got to tell me what it is. Verse 3 and verse 4, Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondworkmen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. She didn't have to, did she? Because who was sitting there? Remember the face of Haman as he was delighted to be invited to dinner and just stuck? What was his face now? Sheer fear. You ever been in a business meeting or maybe in a meeting with other employees when someone has that face? It was me. There was Haman. He knew he was the bandit. He knew he was the guilty. And here Esther is speaking formally and sincerely with the king. She identifies herself with the condemned Jews, with the Jewish nation, without actually naming them directly. She states, "If I found favor in your sight." What do you think the answer to the king was there? You know how people are when you ask questions, and you know how you are when questions are being asked you. You're answering things before you get to the end of it. What do you think the king was doing? Of course you found favor in my sight. He didn't need to get to the end of that question. Of course you have. Take my life and not theirs. Take my life and not theirs. Let me be the substitute for this great wickedness. But it's interesting how she describes it. Whose damage was this truly in the end? Who caused all of these things to happen in the end? Was it Haman or the king? Did you notice the ending of this section? She speaks very frankly. The king's damage. Isn't that interesting? It's bold, isn't it? Please don't let this happen. Now, I believe verse 5 is the response of any man toward his wife. Then King Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, "Who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so?" Remember the question we had just a minute ago, did the king really know what Haman's plans were about these people, about his queen, about the one he honored named Mordecai? I don't think he knew, did you? Doesn't seem that he does, because he's standing up in front of the queen, it seems. Who is he? What's he saying? I'll take care of this. I'll take care of this. Yep. Yeah. He may be setting his own scenes. He is ultimately the one who's responsible. He gave the signet ring out. He gave the authority. He gave the approval, whether knowing what he was approving or not. And that should tell us a good lesson in our lives. We may be supporting something that's sinful and not even know it. But who's still supporting sin? We would be. We've got to keep that into our minds as we live our lives. He understood, who is this evil man? Same thing is true for us, Matthew 15:19. For out of the heart proceedeth evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, theft, false witness, and blasphemies. Where does it come? It came from somebody's heart. Who is he? I want to know. Verse 6. Now here's where I really want to know what Haman's face looked like. The queen said, "The adversary and enemy is that wicked, or is this wicked Haman?" Then Haman was afraid before the king. Now notice this. And the queen. Who is the king's number one? Haman thought it was him, but it's his queen. And I think that should tell us something as well. But without hesitation, the king has requested, "You've got to tell me. You've got to tell me what's your request? What's your request?" Don't you see his anticipation of the questioning and now his anger of his reasoning, the change in that scenario? He was excited to know the question. I'll give you half of my kingdom. I think that's literal. I'll give you half of my kingdom. He's excited. He's glad to be there. He's glad to be among what he thought was good company. Aren't you glad to be among good company? And without hesitation, Esther identifies Haman. Now, here's something that I find is extremely impressive. What could Esther have done instead of having a dinner? What could she have done? You got to think hard on this one. You got to think hard. What could she have done? Could have. Yes, okay. Okay, she could have just talked to the king. What does that mean? Let's think of the implications of that. Yes, yeah. I'm going to answer you yes and no. She could have just went to the king. Remember, she went to the king and she burst in the doors and he had to choose, you're going to die, you're going to live. What could she have done in that moment instead of requesting a dinner? She could have went and told the king behind Haman's back. But what did she do? She brought Haman before the king and told it to his face. Now, that's different, isn't it? Should make us think about how we deal with the problems in our lives. Haman could not refute his charges. Haman could not refute his actions because they were known to the king. And Haman, he couldn't change the law that he had helped sign into law with the king's signet ring. He couldn't have sat down with the king and, explained this little matter away. Find you out. Hell, here they are. They have found Haman out. This has become a truth. Now notice verse 7. Possibly could be the turning point for the king's mind, at least I think it could be. And the king, rising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden. And Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Well, duh, Haman. What did you think was going to happen? And mainly we need to hear that in our lives half the time. What did you think was going to happen? How many times do we try to contort and change the scenarios around us to better serve us? To make us better, to make us look better, to make us feel better, to be us. That's what Haman was doing. He was contorting this kingdom to make him feel like the king. He wanted to be somebody that he couldn't be. How many times do we do that? Do we try to be someone that we're not supposed to be or be someone we cannot be? And Haman recognizes something. I can't talk to the king in his anger because he'll kill me. But I'll plead with Esther. Was the matter in the hands of Esther now? No. They were in the hands of the king. And we need to recognize that when dealing with our problems in life. Many times the problems that we face are generically out of our hands many times, or could be out of our hands. But many times we try to handle things personally and on our own, and it's really the essence of the same thing that Haman was doing. He was trying to contort the world to be for him, and many times we try to handle the world to be for us. Esther did something completely different than the reasoning that we would have in our world. She took it out of her hands. She took it out of her hands. Haman, you can just almost see it in your mind. The king has stormed off. Haman and Esther are there, and he stands up to beg for his life. In verse 8, here's the king again. The king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine. And Haman was falled upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in this house? And the word went out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. Here's another thing we need to recognize, I think is very important in the book of Esther. Our location matters. Were the intentions of Haman to force the queen? Of course not. But what did it look like? Our location matters. There are many places the Christian should never be because of what it looks like. What did the king immediately think? You're destroying my kingdom, now you're trying to destroy my queen? And what did the king no longer want to see? The face of Haman. And they covered his face. Verses 7 through 10 is the wrath of the king. The wrath of the king. One of the chamberlains, verse 9, notice this. He said before the king, Haman built a gallows. One of the chamberlains said before the king, "Behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king, standeth in the house of Haman." Then the king says, "Hang him thereon." Isn't it interesting that the king did not know about this gallows? Doesn't seem that he did. But one of the king's chamberlains knew about this gallows, knew its height, and what I find more impressive, knew who it was for. You think Mordecai knew that too? That would be a good suggestion. He was in the king's gate every day. He was in the place of decisions. He was where the king's chamberlains were. Evidently, the water cooler gossip had gotten around pretty far. Because one of the personal assistants of the king knew exactly what this was, knew its height, and the king's decision was how fast? Pretty much as he spoke. Take care of it. Hang him on it. Tall enough to be seen by everybody. Let's see. I was going to say it's under 100, more than 50 was my 18 inches. Yeah, I wasn't going to do math on the fly. We all know that's not happening today. So let's just go with 75. That sounds great to me. Good round number that I can remember. 75, yeah. So there we go. That's where that's how big the gallows was, no matter where it had been placed. Oh yeah. Its actual height could have been much higher. That's the representation here. Everybody was going to see Mordecai die there. That's what the king had planned, or not the king. That's what Haman had planned. I'll get there. That's what Haman had planned. Is that what happened? Verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath, notice this word, pacified. There's not any delay, it seems, in the king to respond to this chamberlain who says, there's a gallows already prepared. Why don't we use that? Hang him. And there's also no time difference that we can see in the text between the time the king said it and the time he was hanged upon the gallows. I don't think the king knew the gallows had been built either. A lot of things the king didn't know. That tells us something about the king, I think.
You mean to tell me a gallows 75 feet tall and he can't see that?
If you're the king, why do you go outside? You have people to do that for you.
In my younger days, when somebody had done something, bad, the older people would say they ought to hang him higher than Haman.
Mm-hmm. There you go.
People wouldn't know what to talk about.
What's I'm talking about? No. Well, unfortunately, our time is over. Our children are getting ready to come in. Others are getting ready to come in. Thank you for participating in class, and we'll pick up with this next week.